Now, as the Star Wars sequel trilogy fades further and further into the past and away from the spotlight, and those involved in its creation likely feel less and less inclined to toe the company line, if you will, and open up a bit more about what may have really gone on, we may just get some interesting glimpses behind the scenes or learn how people perhaps really feel about certain things in regards to these films. And recently on a podcast, Marianne Brandon and Mary Jo Marquis, two editors who worked on both The Force Awakens and The Rise of Skywalker, the two J.J. Abrams entries in the sequel trilogy, well, they had some interesting things to say about the one movie in the trilogy they didn't work on, that being The Last Jedi, of course, with Brandon saying the following. I feel very much like, in hindsight, that the trilogy, the last part of the trilogy, needed one vision. And she's of course referring to the fact that the Skywalker saga in itself is a trilogy of trilogies, and that she feels the last trilogy in it didn't have a singular vision. This was then followed up by Marquis saying, I couldn't agree more. It's very strange to have the second film consciously undo the storytelling of the first film. I'm sorry, that's what it felt like. And yeah, you can call them a bit hypocritical here, considering pretty much everyone will agree that The Rise of Skywalker then went and undid The Last Jedi, though J.J. Abrams himself has said that's not the case, that he liked what Johnson did and that The Last Jedi didn't necessarily derail his overall vision for the story, that he wanted to bring Palpatine back from the start. Which may or may not be true, we'll never know for sure. But either way, it's clear Rian Johnson had no interest in bringing Palpatine back, and instead wanted Kylo Ren to be the main villain for the overall story, and certainly the final part of the trilogy. An idea that the original writer-director of Episode 9, that being Colin Trevorrow, was also on board with. In fact, his Episode 9 script had Kylo Ren dying as a villain. Anyway, I've said before that the sequel trilogy almost felt like a bitter custody battle between two parents, or perhaps two parents who had joint custody and just have totally different parenting styles, which is maybe why they never saw eye to eye in the first place and went their own ways. You've got the one parent, J.J. Abrams, who maybe has big plans for their kid's future and seems to be thinking about the long game, but maybe doesn't know how he's ever going to get them there. Then you got Rian Johnson, the parent who only gets every other weekend and a couple holidays with their kids and lets them do whatever they want because they want to be the fun parent. They want to enjoy the little time they get, and they're not thinking long term. They're thinking enjoy what you have right now. And then of course the kid goes back to the other parent who spends the next 2 weeks trying to break them of all the bad habits they picked up over the one weekend with that other parent. And in all seriousness, that's how the sequel trilogy felt. Like it got passed back and forth between two guys who just had completely different styles, ideas, and visions. And I think we'll all agree, especially in hindsight, that there should have been a grand plan in place from the start, which I know is something I've talked about at great length before, so instead of droning on about it again, I'll pose this fun question. What do you think Rian Johnson and J.J. Abrams really think of each other? And I know, lots of people will point out that both of them have had nothing but nice things to say about each other. But before you run to the comments to tell me that, ask yourself this. Have you ever said something nice about someone you worked with, or had to get along with someone you really didn't like for the sake of your job or keeping the peace in some sort of situation you were in? Now imagine you work for Disney, the biggest name in entertainment, and you're working on Star Wars, and the world is watching your every move and hanging on your every word. Do you really think you'd bash a fellow director in that situation? Though, as I said at the top, don't be surprised when the further away we get from these films in terms of time and relevancy, the more people might be willing to dish. We've already seen some of the actors have some pretty interesting things to say. Not to mention, all have more or less said they're done with Star Wars, that they don't want to ever return or do streaming shows or any of that stuff. And no, I'm not trying to imply there are tons and tons of juicy behind-the-scenes secrets, or that Johnson and Abrams truly hate each other, and that's why both subverted the other's expectations. I'm just wondering what these guys really think of each other. How did they get along? How did the meetings with each other actually go? You know, when they sat down and supposedly discussed the story? And fun side note here, I've never actually seen a picture of the two of them together, and I have certainly looked. Not trying to push a conspiracy theory that they've never actually met or anything, or that it's in any way proof that they're not friendly with each other. I just find it interesting that you can't find one single picture of the two guys who are primarily responsible for the Star Wars sequel trilogy together. I mean, you'd think there'd be pictures of the two of them together at the premiere of either The Last Jedi or The Rise of Skywalker, or even The Force Awakens. Rian Johnson did have the job at that point. But it seems like JJ attended The Last Jedi and, as far as I could tell, didn't have his picture taken with RJ, and RJ didn't seem to attend the premiere of either The Force Awakens or The Rise of Skywalker, though it's certainly possible he was busy with another project, especially in the case of The Force Awakens, working on The Last Jedi. Either way, I'd love to have been the proverbial fly on the wall during their production meetings to see how they got along and what was said. All we know is that it didn't seem like the two discussed everything the other was going to do, or they just ended up not agreeing, because we had interviews where JJ said he laughed when he read the script for The Last Jedi and saw that Snoke was killed, and that he felt the biggest surprise was how dark Luke was. That the most successful thing the movie does, speaking of The Last Jedi, is subverting expectations. And so that basically brings us back to the question. When J.J. Abrams got the chance to do Episode 9, do you think he was spiteful towards Johnson? Do you think J.J. purposely wanted to stick it to him? Or was he simply going back in line with what he originally wanted to do, which we saw in The Force Awakens? Or was it maybe all somehow, some way, part of one big plan that the two had mostly agreed upon? Because I can't imagine these two guys were able to remove ego completely from the equation. I mean, if what RJ did with The Last Jedi irritated two of the editors of the other films, doesn't it seem entirely possible it irritated Abrams himself too? Did the sequel trilogy really suffer, and us fans have to pay the price for two guys having a custody battle? Well, that's all I've got for you this time. As usual, it's now your turn to tell me what you think. Are these two guys friendly, enemies, or something somewhere in between? Whatever you think, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.